Hello, everyone. This is the first part of the presentation for Wednesday, the 9th of June, for Geography 3243 Indian Country. The first part I wanted to comment on is the idea that American Indian policy or United States federal Indian policy has a tendency to swing back and forth between extremes. You will often hear historians and others who have studied U.S. Indian policy say how there is a back and forth in the sort of the emphasis on separation and autonomy, and another side of, or another end of the spectrum is the desire of the government to assimilate American Indian people and eliminate tribalism and do away with Indian identity and culture. And it's true that the policies sometimes shift quickly, but there's actually our system has some built-in components that tend to slow policy changes. So I'll make that argument that there are a lot of interests that are shifting around in Washington at the moment. As I'm recording this, we have a Democratic-controlled Senate and House of Representatives and a Democratic president. And that's, of course, a pretty big change from what we've had to a degree. It's not a very large majority in either side of the Capitol building, but nevertheless, those political changes are not entirely controlling of Indian policy, because the career or professional bureaucrats that serve in most of the the bureaucracies, particularly the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service, and Education. Most of those people are professionals, and they're not political, or at least they're not intended. They're really not supposed to bring politics into their job, and so that's a good thing. The politicians, of course, include the Secretary of the Interior, but the secretaries of the Interior come and go with presidents, and the people who actually manage day-to-day affairs are usually there for decades at a time. So it's not so whimsical as some people like to say. Nevertheless, there are some changes that have taken place. 1934 was a great example of a change in policy that was really radical. It was, as we'll see later in the course. Judge William C. Canby Jr. of Arizona State University, and he's a law professor, retired law professor, also served as the senior judge in the Ninth District, actually the Ninth Circuit Court, so the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals at the federal level. And he is very much an expert on Indian law. He makes, in his small book called Federal Indian Law in a Nutshell, he makes the point that regardless of your political status, there are four kind of overriding themes that tend to affect Indian policy in the United States. And these are things that have been discovered by the law over time. A lot of them can go right back to the three cases that we'll discuss later in this presentation. what we refer to as the Marshall Trilogy from 1823 to 1832. Um, but anyway, these are the um, four themes that can be identified. Number one, American Indian tribes are sovereign entities with inherent powers of self-government. The point of that is that they are groups and they are not individual persons. So it's important to realize that the government deals directly with other governments, not with individuals, at least for policy concerns. Number two, the sovereignty of the tribes is subject to exceptionally great powers of Congress to regulate and modify the status of the tribes. That's been called something like plenary authority or plenary power. Congress is the ultimate sovereign over the tribes, and Congress has the most power of any branch of government, really, in affecting Indian tribal existence and sovereignty. Number three, the power to deal with and regulate the tribes is wholly federal, and the states are completely excluded unless Congress delegates power to them. And that actually did take place during the termination era of the middle part of the 20th century. We'll talk about it later in the course. You'll read about it. And it's primarily associated with a law that was referred to as PL 83-280, or just PL 280. In that sense, or in that law, certain states were allowed to take the federal government's role in managing Indian affairs. It was particularly important in terms of criminal law, but most of the states that took over Indian oversight, Indian tribal oversight, most of the states that did that, after a few years, decided they didn't want to do that anymore. And but there are still these certain states like Nebraska, a few others, that are PL 280 states, and they are somewhat different from all the other states when it comes to Indian affairs. Oklahoma was not a PL 280 state, and therefore Oklahoma's, although sometimes people think Oklahoma is a little bit different than all the other states when it comes to Indian affairs, really not. Number four, the federal government has a responsibility for the protection of the tribes and tribes' properties, including protection from encroachments by the states and their citizens. Encroachments can be both physical, in the sense that people, particularly white settlers during colonial and early 19th century times, would illegally live on Indian land, in India. They would move into Indian country without authorization, without permission, without rights to claim the land, and so that often that led to disputes. So the federal government has as a responsibility to keep, in some of the laws that we'll discuss later in this discussion, or you'll see me talking about it in class. It was made clear that the federal government attempted to refrain or keep its citizens off of Indian land. Now, encroachment also means, in a modern sense, it's much more relevant to say that encroachment refers to the legal sort of trespassing of states into Indian tribal business. So the states, and Oklahoma is a fairly good example. Oklahoma has encroached upon tribal sovereignty numerous times, particularly during the middle 20th century and late 20th century, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s. And there were a number of Supreme Court cases that decided important things like the ability of tribal governments to issue automobile license plates, or the ability for tribes to authorize and license tobacco retailing that did not pay a state excise tax. And there are a couple of other examples, but anyway, encroachment by the state is still an issue in Indian country at times, but most states and most tribes are quite aware that states really don't stand much of a chance to win a case against a tribe when it comes to a state's government attempting to encroach on tribal sovereignty. Now, I'm going to give you a list of some things here in Canby's book. He identifies a few different forms, or what we might call legal instruments, documents in most cases here. Legal instruments that establish and affect federal Indian policy. And I have a couple of lists here. There's a lot of overlap, so let me I'll point the differences out to you. First of all, there are Indian treaties, treaties between the United States and Indian tribes. Those have the same weight as the Constitution. They're considered to be the law of the land. Treaties have to be ratified by the Senate, or they had to be ratified by the Senate and then signed by the President. However, in 1871, Congress decided that there would be no more Indian treaties. And also, prior to 1871, there were a number of treaties that were abrogated, mostly because of things like the Civil War, in which tribes sided with the Confederacy, and therefore the United States came back and Congress abrogated or ripped up treaties with the tribes and then required new treaties. After 1871, there were no more treaties made between Congress and Indian tribes. However, they just sort of renamed them to formal agreements. You can see formal agreements down here on the list. So they basically replaced treaties, and they still have essentially the weight of the law of the land. We've also discussed federal statute law, or basically legislation, congressional and federal legislation that establish Indian policy. A good example is the Indian Removal Act, but there are a lot of others. The Trade and Intercourse Acts from 1790 to the 1830s. We could take one example. The Indian Removal Act, sometimes referred to as the IRA, at least in your textbook it is, but the IRA in Indian affairs that I always think of is the Indian Reorganization Act, or the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934, and that's another IRA. So very, very different. The Wheeler-Howard Act, Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, was an attempt to reinstate tribal governments and guarantee their sovereignty. All right. Federal statute law and, of course, federal case law, particularly Supreme Court decisions or adjudication, those largely direct how Indian policy sort of takes a turn now and then. So federal case law is kind of the last word, and the Supreme Court really is, in many ways, more of an ultimate authority than Congress, because once they've made their decision, it's very unlikely that that decision is going to be changed unless another set of justices later decide to reverse it. So, and we've talked a little bit about sort of related to federal statute law, executive orders made by the president, and those can be reversed or rescinded when another president enters office. So they're not necessarily permanent. Sometimes they can be permanent, but that tendency or the practice of using executive orders to shape Indian policy ended in 1919. So presidents generally don't bother with executive orders in Indian policy anymore. Now, the other, sort of the last one on the list here, is the administrative rule. And these are oftentimes the things that shape Indian policy that are under the radar, under the political radar of various groups. Basically, administrative rules don't have a lot of accountability. It's often something that a committee within a bureau, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, for example, might develop a policy and then they'll just implement it because they have the authority to do that. It's not off. It's been the case that a lot of administrative rules have been ruled by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, or they've simply been exposed and have brought bad press to the bureaucracy. So that's sort of the most heinous form of shaping Indian policy in most people's opinions, who have an opinion about this. Finally, down here at the bottom is a set of documents or instruments that have been used in recent decades to allow sovereign Indian tribes to make agreements and interact, do business with the states, and even in some cases municipalities. Since states really don't have any ability to regulate activities in Indian country, it's sometimes necessary to negotiate, and it's oftentimes necessary for the tribes to try to get states on board with some of their projects. And so what they do is typically they'll establish a compacting process. So state and tribal compacts have led to a lot of cooperation over recent decades, and that's a good thing. Business contracts and memorandums of understanding, MOUs, are also instruments that allow tribes and states to interact in a positive sense. One other list here, this is a list of what I would call factors that affect the discovery of federal Indian law and the evolution of U.S. Indian policy. When we say the discovery of federal Indian law, the idea here is with common law is something that's constantly changing. It's not really established or created, it's found. And in that sense, the law, a lot of people like to refer to the law as being discovered, as if it were already there. But this list, you'll see, is just about everything you saw in the previous list is here, except a few things like tribal government law. Once tribal governments were revived and really took off after President Nixon's self-determination policy, then they started passing their own laws, their own regulatory statutes, and so sometimes that affects the how federal Indian law works. State laws like that were allowed to affect Indian country, like the PL 280 states. Those can shape Indian policy. And in some cases, state regulatory law will, there may be no way around it, or it may shape Indian policy by not being valid within Indian country. Finally, international law in recent decades has become sort of a minor factor in shaping Indian policy. The United Nations and the European Union both have working groups on the plight of indigenous peoples in the world, and sometimes American Indian tribes have connections with Geneva, Switzerland. So I wanted to just mention a few things about defining the term Indian and who decides who is an Indian. This doesn't have a whole lot to do with Indian country, but if we're going to talk about Indian country, we should also mention this. But most of the time, of course, Native people refer to themselves by their tribal affiliation or their tribal affiliations. In the eyes of the government, however, a Oglala Sioux is an Indian, and a Pueblo person is an Indian, and a Chickasaw citizen is an Indian. So the government doesn't make distinctions of tribes. It divides Native peoples in the United States into three groups. Those are federally recognized American Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and Native Hawaiians. Native Hawaiians don't have a lot of sovereignty yet, but their sovereignty is not recognized yet, I should say. Alaska Natives have a very different history than do the Native peoples of the lower 48, because they were essentially contacted, or at least the federal government and the Native Alaskan peoples, who were American Indians mostly, Aleutian Islanders and the Inuit in the Arctic are maybe somewhat different, but the natives of Alaska have a very different relationship with the federal government because of something called the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1970. So we'll read about that. Very different. So federal Indian law treats federal Indian laws mostly affecting Indian tribes, and then the Indian tribes, of course, have relevance to their people. Now, the term, of course, is not in vogue anymore, Indian, but that's the legal term that's going to stick. So these are some things that I just wanted to make sure we covered. Tribal citizenship is determined by tribes themselves, so that's an important thing to know. So while tribes typically didn't keep strict determinations of their numbers and their populations, it was always always important to the United States to know how many Native peoples were in a tribe, or how many warriors a tribe had, and then later on during the allotment period in the 1880s and 1890s, it became important to have actual lists of names, what were referred to as rolls, and those rolls were used to assign individual Indian people allotments, because oftentimes Native peoples just refused to take allotments, so they were forced to take. And that's all I have to say about that. Okay. If it comes out like this, I don't know what to do. I'll just redo it for you. The textbook mentions Columbus and how, I think the general point was that Europeans arrived, they viewed the native peoples as not really worthy of being taken seriously because of the primitiveness. Now, of course, Columbus arrived into the Caribbean, and the native peoples were the Arawaks and the Caribs. And basically, if you read the letter, Columbus was more interested in how perhaps you could take advantage of the native peoples. And he took 6 of them back with him. So the textbook also mentions the requirement of 1513. Now, the Spanish were under a form of law that was it was a top-down system of law, and the first 2 decades of knowing that or beginning to know there's this new world out there, working with the Holy See, working with the Pope. You probably have heard of the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. The Treaty of Tordesillas was an agreement between the Pope and Portugal and Spain, who were rivals in exploration. And the Pope thought he was giving a good deal to the Portuguese and basically drew a line through what he thought was the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the Ocean Sea, and handed everything to the east to the Portuguese and everything to the west to the Spanish, thinking that there really wasn't anything there. But that was in 1494. And what that did then, of course, was it handed Spain the Caribbean and most of South America and North America. And so the Spanish came up with, the Spanish followed something called the Laws of the Indies, or the Law of the Indies, and that sort of formalized the process of conquest. The concept of the divine right of kings, of course, not limited to Iberia, of course, but in the case of the Spanish, the requirement, the requerimiento, I can't pronounce it, requerimiento, was taken to be, initially, it was one of those ideas that sounded good, and it was maybe to some degree intended to be kind of benevolent, or slightly benevolent, but on the ground, in force, it was used as sort of a tool for conquest. And basically what the requirement was a document that was read to non-Spanish speaking people, declaring that they needed to submit to the King of Spain and give up their freedom, hand over their land, or die. And has anybody ever seen that film back from, I think it's a Robert De Niro film called The Mission? Yeah, if you've never seen that, you get a chance to find it on Netflix or something, have a look at it. There's a scene in it and it's about the Portuguese colonizing the region around what is today Iguazu Falls in Paraguay. And what the theme was is this Catholic, the Jesuits actually, and they were trying to reach these native peoples, and at the same time, the Portuguese were colonizing. So the Spanish, it's a contest between the Spanish and the Portuguese, but the Portuguese are sort of invading and annihilating the native peoples. And in the show, in the movie, you see there's a scene where they're coming in on a river, and the priest is reading the requirement,
basically there are these canoes full of soldiers with muskets or with blunderbusses, whatever you call those, and the Indians are just kind of coming up. They want to know what's going on, and they're reading the requirement, and of course, completely innocent, and so once they don't, decide to get baptized, it's boom. Anyway, that is that system or that requirement was used for conquest. Eventually, a system developed in the New World known as the encomienda system. The Spanish used that to take control of not only land but of the people who lived on it. The encomienda system was it actually was utilized to some degree in New Mexico, but outside of New Mexico it was mostly confined to Mexico and Central America, South America. But the encomienda system was one in which a land grant was given to usually a member of the aristocracy, a second son, or perhaps a retired commander of the military. And with the land came the occupants, came the indigenous people, and they were then subject to his will. So they often put them to work farming or put them to work mining silver or something like that. But the reason we mention this is because this began a reaction, and later on the encomienda system would be outlawed, would be taken out, largely by the work of a Catholic priest by the name of Bartolome de las Casas. And he was also associated with, was a scholar like Francisco de Vitoria, and it's called Victoria in the textbook. He was a Dominican friar who tried to initiate some humanitarian principles with the Spanish in the New World. And he studied Socrates and other European and classical philosophers. But this, the discovery of the New World and all of these people who the Bible didn't explain anything about, it was a conundrum for these scholars. And so anyway, they tried to figure out what we do here. These people aren't Christians, but that we shouldn't be cruel to them. So the ideas were, the ideas that Victoria put forth were that, indigenous peoples were there first. They had a right to their own land. They should be able to maintain and possess their own land. But then at the same time, he had to kind of balance the interests of the crown. So he wasn't very effective for a while. The church would eventually be probably the strongest advocate for indigenous rights in the colonial era in Latin America, at least. This is related to what we'll call the doctrine of discovery. Doctrine of discovery was really vocalized for the first time by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, who we'll talk a little bit more about. But Marshall, was working with ideas that had come before him. So, in terms of this idea of the doctrine of discovery, it referred to basically European geopolitics in the age of discovery and later. So there were European powers, the Dutch, like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English later on, French, that had claims to these newly discovered lands. Well, they were newly discovered in European, of course, but the idea was that the first European power to establish itself permanently would have claim to those lands. And of course, that wasn't always the case. Along the coast of the present-day United States, from Florida up to about Virginia, there was a lot of back and forth between the English allied with the French Protestants, the so-called Huguenots, and the Spanish. And the Spanish, the Spanish were there. The Huguenots were attracted to them, attacked them. The Spanish retaliated. So it wasn't really that clear cut. And of course, the Dutch colonized the Hudson River Valley. The English were on different sides of them. The Swedes even got into the game of colonization. But the idea was that the first European power to really lay claim and hold on to an area had the rights to keep it. These ideas would eventually be consolidated a little bit in ideas of state sovereignty, but that would come much later in 1648. Once the 30 Years' War, 30 Years' War was concluded with the Peace of Westphalia. The idea of Indian title was something that John Marshall came up with, but he was also basing his ideas on some of the early Articles of Confederation laws and policies that were passed in the 1780s. And we'll talk about specifically one of those. So the right of occupancy of the indigenous peoples is what Marshall referred to as Indian title. Indian title was a right of occupancy, but not a right to sell the land. And so this is obviously it's very ethnocentric, and Marshall was the Chief Justice right as the United States was expanding rapidly into the interior of the continent. We'll talk about these cases later. I'm going to move on. This is not the greatest slide. We've talked a little bit about, or you've read a little bit about English colonialism. What I want to say about this is that it's really, the English were so different from the Spanish in that the Spanish and also especially the French sort of integrated themselves into native populations. The Spanish, of course, were the overlords of the native populations. The French, on the other hand, tended to integrate and articulate with the native peoples up in the St. Lawrence Valley and in the Mississippi Valley. They intermarried, had children and families, learned the language. They weren't so concerned with converting native peoples to their way of life. French, I'm talking about. The English, on the other hand, had a real interesting characteristic, a real distinctive characteristic when it came to their relations with native peoples, and that was they wanted separation of territory. They wanted separation of territory. They didn't have much to do, at least early on, they didn't have much to do with engaging with native populations intimately and raising families that would be both European and Native American. That would come later in the late 1700s, but initially there was a lot of this designation of land that was considered non-Indian land and Indian country. So civilized and savage, as they referred to it, the savages. So the way that they attempted to establish boundaries was through treaties, and the first, I believe one of the first was the Puritans, or the separatist Puritans, the Pilgrims at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1621 established a treaty with the local Narragansetts or Wampanoags. So they established one early on in Virginia, which got started much earlier than Massachusetts. Virginia colony was, or the Jamestown colony was a commercial enterprise. They didn't have any backing of the British Crown for the first couple of decades, and because of that, they had pretty lousy manners. Of course, the Jamestown settlers nearly all starved to death the first couple of years and died of, malaria and other illnesses, resorted to cannibalism in some cases. So they became very, very desperate, and the local Powhatan groups didn't necessarily want to keep them around, so their relations disintegrated very early on, and the Jamestown settlers began raiding the corn stashes, the corn winter food reserves of the Powhatan groups. There are a lot of the Powhatans were a confederacy in this area on Jamestown, the James River, and of course the Powhatan Confederacy was quite large and powerful compared to this minuscule number of Englishmen at Jamestown and a few other settlements out there. And the Powhatans in March 22nd, what was it, 1622, 1624, initiated an all-out coordinated attack against the English, killed around 500 settlers, which was a large proportion of the total, a few thousand, and basically attempted to rid the area of these Europeans. But what happened? Well, the English sent word back to England. And that's when the Crown began to take over the Virginia settlement, made it a Crown colony, and then sent in armed troops. So the Powhatans then discovered that the English retaliated dramatically, eventually establishing a boundary line of some sort, or at least an area where sort of like sort of a demilitarized zone between the native peoples and the English settlements. Now, later on, native peoples would be asked to forfeit or to cede land and move elsewhere. Or, in the case of the New England tribes, they were invited to settle in settlements around the English, the Puritans. So the Puritans were the ones who actually were the inventors of Indian reservations. They had these small communities of native peoples who began to interact and live like Europeans, live like English, very, very early on. In Virginia, on the other hand, it was a lot more volatile, a lot less peaceful. Not that it was necessarily peaceful in New England. There were a few wars themselves. And in Virginia, though, the idea of establishing boundaries and getting Indian land cessions became part of the process of expanding into the hinterland of the Chesapeake, lower Chesapeake. So by about 1700, there had been a process of local Indian groups ceding land to the Virginia governor or to whomever was in charge of the colony. It's also happened in the Carolinas, at a different scale. It established, the problems with between the English and the Indians initiated some interesting ideas. For example, in Georgia, as you know, Georgia was established, the colony of Georgia was established by was kind of given over to this Englishman by the name of James Oglethorpe. And Oglethorpe initially wanted a colony, his colony was Georgia, where slavery would be outlawed, where relations with the native peoples would be positive and be good, and where the plantation system wouldn't be in effect. Of course, all of that fell through. The only place, perhaps, along the colonies, the English seaboard, where there was relatively decent relations between the colonial government or the colonial proprietor and the native peoples was in Pennsylvania. And who settled Pennsylvania? William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker. He was an ex-military man. He had fought with Roundheads, in the English Civil Wars, and then he became a pacifist, became a Quaker. Opened up Pennsylvania to religious groups who were seeking religious freedom. The only requirement was they had to be peaceful to one another. And at the same time, William Penn made it a priority to purchase land from native peoples before it was surveyed and opened up for settlements of whites. So Pennsylvania was kind of a good, the best example that we can find. I want to make the point that the English early on, they didn't have, the English settlers did not have an army supporting their presence like the Spanish did, and wherever they were around Latin America. Now later on, they would have numbers, and most of the conflict in the colonial era, the colonial period, would occur not through English regular army or anything like that. It was with the local militias that emerged from the colonists. So the militia movement got started back in the colonial era, right? And these colonial militias were, of course, protecting their own settlements, their own farms from Indian attack. So, just wanted to make that point. English settlement, in some ways, in Virginia was profit motive, well, very much profit motive, and New England was more religiously oriented. That didn't necessarily mean that there was a lot more peace in New England, because the Puritans, after a while, were pretty intolerant of anybody unlike themselves. Anyway, I'm going to skip over this slide for want of time, and we're going to move on to chapter 2, because we've got a lot more material here. You've read, if you've had a chance to read that letter between George Washington and James Duane, this was written in 1783. What's significant about that year? 1783 was the year that the English recognized, and the rest of the world recognized the United States as an independent state, an independent country, the Treaty of Paris. So this letter in 1783 is between George Washington, who is he's a seasoned general, leader of the Continental Army. He has lots of experience with native peoples in New York and Pennsylvania, as well as Virginia, and in not just a military sense, but in kind of a long-term goal sense for the country. So Washington is in this letter. How would you describe the tone of George Washington in that letter? Remember that?
Yeah, it was. Well, it was like cheaper to buy them off instead of fighting them. It was
Certainly.
still, but they still. I can't remember if it was this one or not.
as I was going through it, I kind of pulled a few points. Okay, so the points that I maybe identified, maybe I didn't read all of these necessarily, but within the context of 1783, it was pretty clear to, especially people like Washington and other military folks. They knew they had independence, but nobody was really sure how long that was going to last because a British invasion was considered to be pretty much imminent. They were, they didn't know exactly when it was coming, but they figured the British would come back and take what was, their claim, reconquer the eastern seaboard. And the wild card with that, of course, was that the British had much better relations with the native peoples of eastern North America than the American settlers did. The British, after all, King George tried to separate the colonists from the native peoples by establishing that proclamation line of 1763, right after the French and Indian War was the British were victorious there. So they weren't successful with that. American settlers, in 1763, for example, when the proclamation came down, there were already people living on the other side of the Appalachians. And they certainly weren't going to move because some king on the other side of the ocean declared them, out of bounds. I'm sure it was laughable to them. Even the idea of a penalty of death for being on the other side of the line was probably a joke to them. And of course, a lot of them were trading with the native peoples and had decent relations, but they weren't all at war. The point of that was Washington wanted to gain the trust and gain the alliance of as many Indian tribes as he possibly could in order to, ensure safety against the British attack. The British were lurking still in the Great Lakes. There were Scottish and Spanish agents in the southern states, in Florida, what was referred to as Florida, and that was basically Alabama and Mississippi and Florida, Georgia. So that Washington was hoping that any policies needed to gain the respect and gain the alliance and trust of native peoples for the long-term security of the country. One of the problems, of course, was that whites were encroaching on the Indian lands. So it became necessary to tell those trespassers, those people who were settling illegally on Indian lands, that they were doing so illegally and they would not get the protection of the United States if they were going to break the law. So you'll see that. Washington was trying to win the favor of the Indian tribes to weaken British influence over them. And, as you mentioned, makes a really long point that, it makes, and this is someone who's just, come from a war. He doesn't want to see any more death and destruction. He's saying it makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense to purchase lands than try to conquer lands, and it's probably the moral thing to do as well. So anyway, now where does all that come into play? The Trade and Intercourse Acts were a series of laws passed by Congress, federal laws, a whole series of them, and these were important because they really kind of set the tone for the United States federal Indian policy. Should mention also that the United States Constitution, as I've said, mentions native peoples, it mentions tribes 3 different times in the document, primarily for counting purposes and taxation purposes. And the Commerce Clause, where the federal government is given sole purview over interacting formally with Indian tribes. However, the Constitution was written, I think the final draft of it was finished in late 1787. Of course, it wasn't ratified until 1789. But before the Constitution was even finished, before it was finished being written, there was another document that was completed in the spring of 1787 called the Northwest Ordinance. Heard that, right? So the Northwest Ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance mentioned that Native American people had, or basically it said that American settlers can't go into Indian country legally. If they do so, they need to be licensed traders. If they cause trouble in Indian country, then they're going to be subject to American laws, all right, and punished. Basically, the Trade and Intercourse Acts were what's referred to sometimes as the non-intercourse acts. Non-intercourse, trying to control trade and interaction with the native peoples. Just repeats all that stuff, each one of them. And so here are some points of the policies that were established by the Trade and Intercourse Acts. Number one, it attempts to separate Indians from non-Indians in terms of geography. In other words, not necessarily keep the Indians out of United States territory that's been ceded by Indian tribes, but to keep the whites out of Indian country and to keep white settlers from causing trouble in Indian country. Is it me or is this thing just bouncing up and down? Okay, the boundaries were established in Indian country, and the areas settled by native peoples were tried to be protected, or the government tried to protect those areas from non-Indian incursions, encroachments. It prohibited whites from purchasing lands from Indians. We'll see that in a second. That's a big one. A lot of these are kind of overlapping. Indian traders were subject to federal regulation in the Trade and Intercourse Acts, and so this established sort of if you were a trader, you had to get a license. Later on, federal officers called Indian agents would be sent out to these communities. Non-Indian depredations on Indians were made federal crimes. So here we have the federal government sort of showing up as the law enforcement agency. And the federal government even promised to compensate victims, whether they were Indians victimized by white depredations or whites victims of Indian depredations. So the idea was to try to diffuse hostilities. However, the Trade and Intercourse Act, this is important later, Trade and Intercourse Acts did not try to regulate Indian conduct upon themselves within Indian country. All right, so it didn't say you all have to get along. It just said, in your land, do as you wish, just don't come back and cause trouble over here. And I'll post this. All right, on to the Marshall Trilogy. The Marshall Trilogy. It wasn't on Netflix, but it was a series of Supreme Court decisions in 1823. Something called Johnson versus McIntosh. Didn't even involve any Indians at all, really. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, and then Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. Just the quick part here is that Johnson and McIntosh had engaged in, one had sold land to the other. Right? However, the one who had sold the land had purchased it directly from an Indian, I think an individual. And so the title wasn't legitimate. So basically this case went to the Supreme Court because the decision was, is this title valid? And the Supreme Court, well, John Marshall found it to be, let's see exactly, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. It involved, of course, Cherokee Nation and the state of Georgia. And it was the outcome, it was sort of the outcome of a lot of things that I'll have to explain, but it was never even heard by the Supreme Court. That was its significance, was that the Supreme Court said, not our jurisdiction. Okay? And then Worcester versus Georgia, what that did was, and thank you very much, Georgia, because with those two cases, the Supreme Court pretty much solidified the relationship between states and tribes, in that states really have no authority whatsoever over in Indian country. Okay, so
don't you think you can show up to either of those two people?
representatives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. All right, so Johnson versus McIntosh. This is kind of the cliff notes of it. Marshall was trying to reason, how do you, this is where this whole doctrine of discovery idea came into play. And Marshall really pulled out of, this history of this relationship, two types of title, okay? So the land doesn't just have one title, it has two types of title if Native peoples are possessing it. If Native peoples possess the land, that's one thing. If a European empire takes control of the continent, or at least part of the continent, that's a different thing. So this, what Marshall found the United States to have, and before the British Empire, was what he referred to as exclusive title out of geopolitical geopolitics of the age of exploration. And it's kind of a strange wrangling, I don't know, of ideas here, but the idea was that it's kind of like the too big to fail argument. We're not going home. We're not going back to England. So this idea of exclusive title is that this is ultimate. The United States is the ultimate sovereign here, and only the holders of ultimate sovereignty can make deals with other sovereign empires or whatever to transfer territory, large amounts of territory. However, he tried to fit the idea of a possessory right into this also. So Marshall found that came up with this concept of original Indian title, what we would refer to today as aboriginal title. And that was a legal, what he called it was a just and legal claim, or right, to occupy and to live off of the land as you so desire, as a culture group or as a nation of people, and to retain possession of it, but not to dispose of it. In other words, you have all the right in the world. Sorry, for some reason my toes just started catching fire. I don't know why. It's my shoes or something. Native peoples have every right to possess the land that they have always had. They have every right to occupy it, and they have the right not to have to get rid of it. That's a really important one. They don't have to get rid of it if they don't want to. But they can't get rid of it if they do want to, except to the United States federal government. Why is that? Well, what if China showed up and said, well, they'd like to purchase some land from you, citizen band Potawatomi Nation? They can't say, well, yeah, we'll sell you some land. They can't do that. Not according to the United States. Another facet is any removal of the Indian title. Removal of the Indian title is basically the removal of a characteristic of the land. It's an abstract characteristic, But if an Indian tribe decides to cede the land and get compensated for it at fair market value, whatever that was, then that land is it's always been under the purview supposedly of the United States, right? But the United States is able, because of that cession, it's able to erase the Indian character of the land. The idea is it's able to, the term is extinguish Indian title. Extinguish that Indian characteristic so that the federal government can then hand land over to non-Indians, and the way that works is that the United States government issues a patent to the land, sort of like the bill of sale, or it's a title, essentially. It's a form of title, but it's the first title to the land. And so the idea of removing Indian title is the basis of the dispossession. There's a systematic dispossession of Indian land. However, there's plenty of Indian country left, and most of it's not, the vast majority of it is not original Indian title land. It's land in reservation. So we'll talk about what that means. Any questions here? So Johnson versus McIntosh basically invalidated a sale of land that had been sold to an individual from an Indian tribe without going through the federal government, and therefore the problem with the land was that Indian title was still there. And the guy who purchased it didn't have the right to hold it because the United States had not extinguished the Indian title to the land first, or neither had the British. And I've got to plug in this power before we die, before another computer breakdown. Any questions about that? I feel like I'm beating a dead horse maybe, but I'll try to move a little faster. Okay. This is some more notes on the same sort of thing. You have to, according to Marshall, you have to extinguish Indian title by purchase rather than conquest. All right. But otherwise, the concept of Indian title remains intact if it's not purchased or taken by conquest. This right of occupancy is basically what is referred to as Indian title. Aboriginal title today also refers to other lands in other areas, other parts of the world. The British Crown had colonial governments that established treaties with Indian tribes, so the United States was sort of following in that lead. The difference, of course, was that the decisions for the treaties were ratified by Congress rather than by the British Crown. The sovereign was with the people. Okay, another facet that I haven't mentioned yet is that according to, once the Constitution is in place, then we have a really important amendment in the Fifth Amendment. And so Native peoples, and this would come up back, this would become an issue in the middle part of the 20th century, after World War II. Basically, according to the Just Compensation Clause of the Fifth Amendment of to the Constitution, just compensation means that the federal government can, or any local government can declare eminent domain. It can condemn land. It can condemn private land, but it has to compensate the owner of that land at fair market value, or what's referred to as just compensation. And that goes for Indian tribes as well. You can't take land through what's called a taking. The term taking is when the government confiscates your land or condemns the land or damages the land. That land has to be, the owner of the land has to be compensated in a fair way. It's a classic example of the United States Constitution limiting government, limiting the powers of government. That's what our Constitution does. It's different than most other constitutions in that our Constitution is all about what the government cannot do. Not so much about what the government can do, but jurisdiction-wise. So I've got a better slide of this idea. We'll talk about much later the Indian Claims Commission Act of 1946 when we get to termination. We'll read about it before I talk about it. So what constitutes a taking of Indian land by the government? If the government's land use after, this is according to analysis during the 20th century, if the government's land use after the taking is not consistent with the continued tribal occupancy, then it is a taking. So, for example, if the government builds a dam on a river that runs through a reservation and it floods a huge area of the reservation, then the government had better compensate the tribe for that loss. Other things include such as condemning land for national forests, which is an example that we'll look at later. Inclusion of Indian land in a federal grazing district. So a lot of things happening. So this is the actual phrasing of the Just Compensation Clause. It's very short. It's a short part of a short paragraph of the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And person is a very it's a useful term. It's very intentionally ambiguous. It can also refer to a group of people. So a person doesn't necessarily mean an individual. So it could be a company, whatever, an entity. Just a point here, and the headlines are the most important on these slides. Only Indian tribes, not individuals, can possess Indian title. All right? So Indian title is always considered to be the title of a tribe. And we talked about the Non-Intercourse Acts, how they are intended to protect tribal title so no individual claims can exist. And there was a small caveat. We came around in 1985, but we don't need to worry about that at the moment. We'll actually read about it in the very last chapter of U.S. versus Dan, two of those cases. But basically, any citizen of an Indian tribe can own private property, fee simple title, but that doesn't have anything to do with Indian title. Okay? So Native people can own private property and pay taxes on it, pay state property, ad valorem taxes, whatever. It has to be Indian country. It either has to have Indian title or it has to be restricted land or trust land. Most Indian country is trust land today. The tribal trust lands, those are lands held by a tribe in federal trust. Like I keep thinking of the agency grounds just east of the town of Pawnee in Pawnee County. The Pawnee Nation owns, or the Pawnee Nation recognizes those 600 or 700 acres of their rodeo grounds and stuff, and the old agency buildings and stuff. Those are, that's considered a reservation. And it really is basically a reservation. It's trust land held in trust by the United States government for the exclusive use of the Pawnee people. On the other hand, or similarly, lands that have been taken out of a reservation, lands that have been parceled out of a reservation for the exclusive or for the use of an individual allottee, member of that tribe, lands that have not managed to move from federal trust status, or what's referred to as restricted status. Those lands that have not managed to fall out of restricted status are still trust lands. They're still owned or held by the federal government in trust for the Indian tribe, which has then, or actually for that individual Indian allottee, or hundreds of heirs of allotments. So restricted allotments, those are still federal trust land. They retain Indian title. They retain it. They're held in trust. They're not necessarily original title. So the United States holds the exclusive title. The point here is that those lands cannot be alienated. They cannot be conveyed to private ownership unless they go through the United States first. This was the big issue when it came to, what is a restricted allotment, by the way? Are you familiar with that term? Restrictions, the restriction refers to, you'll read about allotment later, but it's so difficult to, I have to talk about stuff that you haven't read about yet in order before you understand what I'm talking about now. But the allotments were lands taken, subdivided out of reservations, assigned to an individual native person, and in most cases it was like 160 acres for an adult, or adult male, and then the adult male could possess that land for a certain amount of time, usually 25 years, and after 25 years the idea, at least in the law, was that the United States would issue a patent and make that land private property, no longer trust land. It would remove it from trust. So the individual native person would have private property. But what comes with that changeover from trust land to private property?
Taxes, stuff like that.
Property taxes, yeah. And what comes, what does that mean? That also means that, it also means that if it's private property, you can go to the bank and you can mortgage it. If it's federal trust property, you can't mortgage it. That'd be kind of like saying, I'm going to mortgage Half Dome in Yosemite National Park. Oh, well, you don't own that. Well, the United States owns it, but they won't do that. So nobody's going to give you a loan for anything that they can't possibly possess. So Indian allotments initially could not be mortgaged, okay, but they weren't taxed. But that was a big problem. Many people who got allotments were ready to use them and capitalize on them, but couldn't because of the 25-year restriction. Right? That created a big problem that we'll get to later. later on, of course, if for some reason the allotment did pass out of trust status, you did get a patent for it, you had to pay taxes on it, which also meant that if you didn't pay taxes on it, the county could come and take it, right? You could sell it on the courthouse steps. And so that happened also. So the term alienation or alienation of land refers to the passing of the land from trust status to non-trust status. We want to take a break, don't we? Another break? Is that okay? You want to go for it? Okay. Well, if you need to, we can. And I'll wait for Steve to get back.
Yeah, my family has property down in Follett that was for the Indian land. The house and that my grandma lived in at the time had that 1 acre property with the house is what we pay taxes on, but the rest of the acreage we don't pay taxes on.
So how did you manage to get the house out of trust, or is it still in trust?
I'm not really familiar.
Because
with
there
that.
are-
I have to ask my.
There are lands that are in trust. Well, it's basically the same thing. You call them restricted allotments or allotments in trust. Neither one of them are taxed. How many owners are there of the land?
It was my.
Is it fractionated?
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah. Hard to avoid when you have like 5 or 6 generations that have been there.
Yeah, there's my grandpa donated a whole bunch of land, so they built Indian church on that. Got donated.
What's the name of the church? Because I've taken pictures of a graveyard in Fufalla around the church.
It's off of Highway 9.
Yeah, I probably have a picture of it.
I'm happy. Yeah, there's. I don't know how familiar you are with Utah and Highway 9 going west, but there's this huge, massive bowl right there on the left side of the highway, and there's a street that goes that is a part of it. That street there used to be a whole lot of our family.
So is the church at an intersection now? Like a county
No, it's a
road?
little bit further back.
Okay, maybe I didn't see it. We'll take a break, real quick. So you didn't miss much.
Sorry.
So, restrictions lead to fractionation, which the author of your textbook calls fractionalization, which is completely wrong. It's fractionation. But we'll get to that eventually. But yeah, that's the big issue. See, and even land that's not necessarily severely fractionated land tends to wind up underutilized for whatever reason, and it doesn't take too many owners to cause problems. At least, if your family's like my family, then there's always going to be issues. So there'll be a reason for somebody to say no, you can't do that. That's just the way families operate, though, right? Extended families. Extended families. Like second cousins and stuff like that.
Yeah.
All right. So the concept of Indian title as expressed in the Trade and Intercourse Acts, I think I covered it in here. You can look at it later. Okay, those are the important points that you probably want to see for exam stuff. Okay, Johnson versus we've already covered this, but The I've already kind of described that. Review, I guess. Removal. You know the ultimate basis for the Indian Removal Act? What state was the state that argued most vociferously for Indian removal? It was Georgia, right? In fact, Georgia is, not necessarily, the state of Georgia got kind of caught up in a problem. Who was president in 1802? He won the election of 1800. He had red hair. Third president. He's on a $2 bill. Thomas Jefferson, all right? So, nobody's seen a $2 bill in a while, I guess. I haven't seen a dollar bill in a while. So Thomas Jefferson is president, right? Thomas Jefferson is highly regarded for the Declaration of Independence, et cetera, great scholar, scientist, et cetera. Slept with slaves, and had children by his slave that didn't have anything to do with the class. But I used to really love Thomas Jefferson until I really got to know him that well, and read enough about him. But Thomas Jefferson was pretty lousy at understanding the way trade works, and he had some really big bumbles in his presidency. But one of them in 1802 was this: the state of Georgia was the last state to get rid of its. When the Constitution was ratified, there were a lot of so-called what were they called? Compromises. There were a lot of compromises, right? To get all the states to ratify the Constitution, everybody had to get something, and one of the big compromises was that the states would hand over their western land claims to the federal government in exchange for the federal government forgiving their war debts. So the state of Georgia had claimed everything to the west to the Mississippi River. And so that's basically most of Alabama, most of Mississippi. And the state of Georgia, of course, was claiming land that was tied up in Spanish claims, etc. So it couldn't really be handed over to the federal government so easily. So this was kind of good for Georgia. But the native peoples who lived there were living, the Cherokees particularly, and the Muscogee Creeks. They were in those Uchis. They were living within the boundaries of the state of Georgia early on, and the federal government wouldn't take those western lands until it was clear that there were boundaries that were agreed upon and such. So in 1802, under Jefferson's watch, the state of Georgia made an agreement with the federal government called the Georgia Compact. Ever heard of that? Georgia Compact? Georgia Compact was a deal that was cut with the federal government that if the federal government would remove the Indian population from within the boundaries of the state of Georgia, then the state of Georgia would what? Would cede those western lands? No, actually, had already ceded them, but the promise was that the federal government, the promise to Georgia was the federal government would remove those, the Indian population someday into the near future. That was made in 1802. So by 1820, by the 1820s, Georgia is, asking the federal government, okay, you made a promise, we gave those western lands to the federal government, but there's been no attempt to remove native peoples and extinguish Indian title. That was the key, to extinguish Indian title from those lands within our state boundaries. Okay, so the state of Georgia had a pretty good argument with the federal government that it needed to do right on its promise. But of course, by the 1820s, the Cherokee Nation had established a judiciary. It had a newspaper. It had Princeton-educated lawyers serving on its courts, and it was beginning to establish what they refer to as a light horse, a police force. It was beginning to express itself, the Cherokee Nation was again beginning to express itself as a territorial entity, right? And the state of Georgia realized this. And the state of Georgia had a very legitimate complaint, legitimate within the constitutional law of the United States, and that, Wilson Lumpkin, the governor of Georgia at the time, made a big argument. He said, look, what the Cherokees are doing by creating, they have this territory that they claim, they have the right to be there, it's, Indian title land, their Aboriginal lands, and they've sold a lot of their lands, and they had this one area left, but what they were doing was they were basically creating a state of their own within the boundaries of an existing state. And that's a direct violation of the Constitution. It's Article 3, I think, something like that. So that put the pressure on the federal government. Okay? Put a lot of pressure on the federal government that it needed to make good with its promise to the state of Georgia. And that argument that, the Cherokees are creating what looks a lot like a state with an executive branch and a legislature. It has a house of, has an upper house and a lower house. It has, it was modeled after the United States, and they were functioning as their own government. They had their own laws. They had their own land use policies. They charged tolls for people moving through their lands. They were basically functioning like a state government. However, up in the north, outside of the cotton belt, and outside of the South, people in the middle colonies in New England had a lot of sympathy for the Cherokees, because they realized that they were, the Cherokees and the Muskogee Creeks and the Chickasaws and Choctaws, especially those four groups. The Seminoles were an offshoot of the Muskogean groups, right? So they just went down to Florida for a while. They were another recognized later as civilized tribe. But the Cherokees and the Creeks and the Chickasaws and Choctaws were considered to be working towards civilization. They were doing everything that the government wanted Indians to do. They had assimilated voluntarily, because they were interacting with the white frontier for a long time. They, most spoke English to some degree, and they had every right to be there. However, there were a lot of southern landowners and southern farmers who coveted the lands that they held for whatever reason, especially south of the Cherokee Nation. where it would later become a central part of the Cotton Belt. So cotton lands were in great demand, but the northern states had a lot of sympathy for those for the native peoples. Well, number one, it wasn't their problem, okay, and number two, they realized that the Southerners were wanting to extend slavery into farther into the South, which they didn't like. So this became a north-south issue, just like slavery. That meant that there was a lot of, it was not an easy argument to convince the Middle Atlantic states like Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and the New England states that the Indians needed to be removed. So that's when, of course, Andrew Jackson comes along and capitalizes on the South's, the Southerners' want to remove Indians from the South and open those lands up for settlement. Well, Andrew Jackson was definitely not the very first president to consider Indian removal. In fact, I think you may have read George Washington's letter. There may be some inklings about that there. He had some ideas about it, about the need to remove people from the frontier so that they can, acculturate or assimilate, and use his term back then. Eventually, he and Jefferson especially believed that, if you remove the Indians to the west, in 1803, suddenly we had a huge west, right? Robert Livingston, under Jefferson's watch, purchased Louisiana from the French. And suddenly there's this west on the other side of the Mississippi River. So Jefferson and others after him believed, well, the best thing to do is to allow these people to go far to the west, and by the time the American population grows enough to get to the west, everything will be fine. They'll have their own land, whatever. Of course, they completely ignored the fact that Louisiana was already occupied by lots of native people already. So Indian removal was not something that was revolutionary. It was kind of a concept. It started off as sort of a benevolent concept, and then later became sort of a pragmatic idea, and later desperate, a very desperate sort of thing for a lot of people. General Winfield Scott, who I think Mount Scott down in Wichita Mountains is named for. Winfield Scott was the sort of like the Army, well, he was really the highest commander in the United States military for a long time, up until the outbreak of the Civil War. But Winfield Scott was he had fought in the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, and then other things. But he mentioned when he retired, Major General Winfield Scott, he said that the very worst job he ever had was supervising the forced removal of the Cherokees from their homes. And I have to state that the Cherokees were removed forcibly, but there was a treaty signed in 1835. A small proportion of the Cherokee Nation moved to Indian Territory in 1835. In fact, there were Cherokees that had moved there since the 1818. So, but the majority of the Cherokees decided, they weren't going until they were forced. And it was typically the local militia groups that tended to harass the Cherokees, force them out of their homes. The United States federal forces are, they're always talked about as initiating the forced removal, but they were the ones that were there to protect the tribe. They didn't do a very good job necessarily, and it moved during the winter time, which was a disaster. So, but anyway, it was a sad story. But removal and Indian removal would not be limited to the 5 civilized, so-called civilized tribes. It would also include groups in the old Northwest, north of the Ohio River. Well, some ramifications of the Indian Removal Act. Let's see. The Indian Removal Act did not actually. Well, I guess I put a few questions here. These are sort of like trick questions. What tribes were removed by the Indian Removal Act? Well, you got somebody on the street here in Tulsa. I'm sure you'll get answers, right? What? And people will tell you, oh, well, the Indian Removal Act, that did this, that removed the Indians. Did it really? No. What did the Indian Removal Act do? And if you've read the excerpt from the actual, well, it's actually not a very long, I think the whole thing's there. What did the Indian Removal Act do? It did not actually remove any Indian tribe. It certainly didn't do so forcibly. It did not take any land from any tribes. In fact, the Indian Removal Act was actually contained safeguards intended to make removal not devastating, right? But it wasn't carried out that way. So the law itself merely created an authority to negotiate land cessions and grant Western lands to Indian tribes. Okay? That's what it did. It gave the authority to the executive branch, basically, to the Office of Indian Affairs in the Department of War. Gave authority to negotiators to meet with tribes and to work out treaties of cession. And that's what they did, except what was the problem? They often did so with removal. Removal also, not only fractured, or not only created divisions within the United States, or accentuated cultural divisions within the United States, regional divisions, sectional divisions. It also created lots of divisions within tribes. There were, in every tribe, there were the groups that were sometimes referred to as the progressives, which wouldn't make any sense today. Okay? But the progressives were the more acculturated, usually wealthier, so-called mixed bloods, who had white fathers, and who probably didn't even speak native languages, but they were the ones who typically were ready to move because they saw opportunity in this law. They saw opportunity. Well, look, we're losing this land, but look at the possibilities of massive, land holdings in the West. To them, private land holdings, but they wouldn't be private. That was to their advantage. On the other hand, usually the so-called traditional faction, which was usually the majority, said, we don't want to give up our lands, we want to leave our home. There's no reason for us to go west. And this sounds crazy, it sounds terrible, but it's true. A lot of the people of the 5 tribes, regardless of whether they were progressive or traditional, feared the West. They feared the Indians in the West because traditionally, some of them, like the Cherokees, had traditionally waged war against groups like the Osages, and and they knew that the Osages didn't want them anywhere close to them. Eventually, the Chickasaws, or the Choctaws and Chickasaws, would remove fairly early in the 1830s, and in 1830, and the United States military would have to establish forts to protect them from the Comanches. And that's another thing that the Indian Removal Act did. It established military bases, basically military forts, to protect native populations from the more the southern plains groups who were going to get dispossessed by them. Okay. Here it is. Required military occupation of the West. There's a really good book on this subject, actually, of the sort of the fighting between the Chickasaws, who are really the westernmost settled of the southeastern nations, the Chickasaw and the Comanches, and they were at war on and off for all the way up until the Civil War. Okay, you know about the Trail of Tears. So just keep in mind that the Indian Removal Act really didn't do anything but allow this negotiation. And of course, each Indian nation would sign various treaties. Those, in every case, I guess, there was a faction of the tribe that said the treaty's illegal because we weren't part of that negotiation. We did not agree to it. You know, so the people who were dead set against negotiating and ceding land oftentimes just walked away from the discussion and said, we're not giving up land if you're going to do this. And in the case, I'm more familiar with the Cherokee history, but in the case of the Cherokees, what they did was they passed a law before the treaty was negotiated. Passed a law and said, anybody who sells land to the United States government, who cedes land, is subject to the death penalty. Subject to, and the three men who are related who signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, once they got to Indian Territory, they were all assassinated. Okay, so and even one of them, I think it was the older chief, Major Ridge. I think he's the one who said, and when he signed it, supposedly he said this, that I just signed my own death warrant. He knew he was going to be killed. So just keep that in mind with Indian removal. Treaties were negotiated. Typically, they're considered illegal, by a large group of and each nation, refers to its removal treaty. The Choctaws, what was that one? Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. That was my favorite name for a treaty. All right, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. I think we've got time for these. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, as I mentioned earlier, was not even heard. The Supreme Court wound up not hearing it, but that's why it's so significant. Okay. What happened was, of course, what Georgia was doing to the Cherokees decided, since the state of Georgia was encroaching on their territory, that they would go directly to the Supreme Court and complain, as is allowed by the Constitution, by a foreign power. Okay? So if there is a foreign state that has a complaint against something, some group in the United States, they go to the Supreme Court and hear it. And the Supreme Court under John Marshall said, no, we're not going to hear an argument from an Indian tribe because they're not a foreign power. They're sovereign, but they're not a foreign sovereign. That is, they're within our boundaries, and therefore they are, and they're nations of people, they're distinct nations of people. They consider themselves a nation of people. They have every right to do that. But it said they are not foreign nations. Instead, they are domestic, meaning they're within the boundaries of the country, and they are dependent. And those three words, or really those two words, have so much meaning within federal Indian law today. Domestic and dependent. In other words, they're within the boundaries. They're not foreign entities. They're not foreign powers. And they are dependent in the sense that they are dependent on the federal government for military protection, for national defense, whatever. Not necessarily economically dependent, although that would sometimes come later, right? But they are certainly not foreign. And so what the Supreme Court said was, since you're not foreign and you're not, an independent foreign power, we don't have jurisdiction to hear this case. So it threw it out. And in doing so, of course, Marshall wrote a lot of things about this that became part of federal Indian law. He ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a state, and it was ruled by a nation distinct, and it was ruled by a nation that had a distinct political society, separated from others, capable of managing its own affairs. That was a quote. But this established this particular event of, and there's a Latin legal term for it. I can't remember what it is. Basically, not hearing it. Established the federal obligation to Indian tribes as wards of the state, and this was these were his words, Marshall's words, that they are like wards, like orphans, I guess, a ward of the state. They're wards, and they're in a state of pupillage, so they're learning, and it's pretty condescending, isn't it? But that wordage continues to have a lot of meaning in the federal trust obligation. Okay? So this established a federal trust relationship, or it kind of cemented the federal trust relationship, in which the United States is obligated to protecting the interests of the tribes. And by interests, I mean property and political autonomy. Yeah.
Was he pushing for that agenda, or was he just simply reciting what he felt was at the time?
I think the answer to both is yes. And Marshall was very much, the activist. He's considered to be the justice who sort of brought the Supreme Court into sort of the full measure of the three branches of our government. And certainly he was there a long time, and he's considered to be by far the most influential Chief Justice ever. So, and his, there during the formative years of it. So. The Worcester versus Georgia case followed pretty closely on the attempt by the Cherokees to be heard. But this one was heard. Now, Samuel Worcester was a New England missionary living in the Cherokee Nation, and he was, of course, being a Yankee, he was not particularly welcomed by Georgia. But what happened was that Georgia passed a law that no laws, or basically passed a law that the laws of the Cherokee Nation are invalid, and then also required that non-Indians be licensed by the state of Georgia to enter the Cherokee Nation. And so he wasn't licensed, and this was all kind of public, intentional scenario or circus. And what happened was, since he was obviously white, non-Indian, living, well known to be living within the Cherokee Nation, well-respected man. And so what happened with the state of Georgia, hauled him into jail for violating that state law that they, that you couldn't be there without their permission. And basically the reason he, allowed himself to be taken in by the state was that he knew that the attempt by the state of Georgia to extend its jurisdiction into Indian country would bring this to the Supreme Court. So he wound up being the subject of that. And of course, the opinion by Marshall was that, in his opinion, he specifically excluded state jurisdiction from Indian country, and that remains very, very important in Indian law today. So, except in a very few certain cases, mainly the PL 280 states, and Oklahoma is not a PL 280 state, states don't have authority in Indian country. Okay? Period. All right, last slide. Look at that. We got that. Last slide. Indian sovereignty and sort of a realistic definition, at least these are sort of some thoughts of mine. According to Marshall in Johnson versus McIntosh, right, 1823, Marshall considered, he recognized tribal sovereignty to exist, but not as independent nations yet. In 1823, he wasn't there yet. He was just saying that, they had this right to possess the land, and the United States government had to buy it from the tribe before it could create a title for land that could then go into the land market, be exchanged. Because to Americans, land is a commodity. But Native peoples were subject to the plenary power of Congress. But this kind of shows how tribal sovereignty, the concept of tribal sovereignty, is dynamic. Because just within those few years of Marshall's three cases, tribal sovereignty changed. It sort of grew basically, I guess we could say Marshall discovered a lot of things. Discovered that Indian sovereignty was very much exclusive of state sovereignty of the states. So tribal sovereignty then is dynamic, and it can change rapidly with changes in the politics of the United States. Usually doesn't occur too rapidly, but it can. And, finally, tribes may think of this as tribes can be analogous to U.S. state governments, but they were not created by Congress, like the states, well, except for the 13 original states. That was the Northwest Ordinance, right? The Northwest Ordinance in 1787 established the process by which states would be created. They would be created by Congress. It created a process where they would be established as territories, and then they would get so many people living there, and then they could apply for statehood. The key, though, was that the Northwest Ordinance made it clear that all new states would have exactly the same status or standing within the Union as the original 13 states. There weren't going to be, the original 13 states and then sort of peripheral, weaker states in the interior. They're all going to have the same degree of significance, same degree of power within the Union. So Congress didn't create these these nations, in some cases, that maybe were trying to function as states. So they're problematic, at least to, by the 1830s. They're kind of problematic in that their internal affairs are their own business. The federal government, what's the relationship between the federal government and the states when it comes to states' autonomy, states' rights? What's the most important part of the Constitution protecting states' rights? I've asked a question that I can't answer because I can't remember at the moment, but I think it's Article 5 or something like that. Or is it something? Anyway, basically, all powers that are not specifically taken over or given to the federal government are reserved by the states, right? It's an article, not an amendment, I think. Is it an amendment?
It's our,
Okay, Article 4, Article 5. But anyway, so what I'm trying to get at is the federal government can't just decide that it's going to change the laws in Idaho. It can't change divorce laws in Idaho. Because that's the purview of the state of Idaho. And this is sort of, this is kind of where the federal government in the early to mid 19th century, the court and the federal government are looking at Indian tribes and saying, okay, well, how much authority do we have to affect these nations of people? Although that the reality of all that would come later.